Well, suddenly Denmark is in the news, and not necessarily in a good way. It is probably embarrassing for lefties, progressives, and Nordic lovers like myself to discover that Denmark is the poster child for the really hardline changes to asylum and immigration being introduced by the Labour government here. And yet, the architect of that in Denmark has said they think it wouldn't work in the United Kingdom. We discuss why. We also look back to what's been described as the circular firing squad of Labour's inept briefing against Wes Streeting and the kind of will she, won't she, hokey cokey budget where the tax rises that were supposed to be inevitable have suddenly been offlaid by discovering some money down the back of the sofa. All that and much more coming. Those are the headlines. Now for the podcast.
Well, hi folks, and welcome to this week's Leslie Riddoch podcast. I was minded of the old, was it Punt and Dennis that had the Worst Week of the Week award awarded weekly on a week-by-week basis. It's been a bad week for the UK government, as we might say, every blinking week. In fact, it's been so bad this week, I find myself when I'm trying to prepare for this, going back and thinking, but did that happen this week or last week? Because it's just all rolling into one. I mean, what a total guddle. How are you, Leslie?
Well, still sort of, I think a lot of people who've had one of the lurgies will say, a lot of my pals have said, you really need to get that there's this post-viral fatigue thing. So I keep going to stuff and then sort of finding myself semi-asleep in the middle of the meeting and wondering why. So, not at full tilt. But I mean, even at sort of 1% tilt, the thing that actually, it took a while for the penny to drop last week as to quite how unbelievably weirdly crap the thing was about, briefing that dear old Keir Starmer, the most unpopular, man since sliced bread, that Keir Starmer would stand up to anyone who was challenging him for the prime ministership, when just at that particular point, nobody was just, actively thinking that. Andy Burnham had been seen off before the conference and the rest of them looked like they were milling about, but nobody was basically chipping over the top. And obviously, fingers pointing towards Wes Streeting, who I see a description of this. A former government aide said that the decision to pick a battle with Wes Streeting before his morning round on the TV and radio is like an elephant picking a fight with a shark and choosing to do it in the middle of the ocean. So it's just kind of, what? So, of course, Streeting strutted around in his element. There's a guy that loves the limelight and deals with it very well and just, had all his little kind of funnies rehearsed about, references to traitors, which seemed to be de rigueur last week. Hopefully we're over it now. But just unbelievable. And I wonder, because, you have spent time as a minder, my dear, what the heck could anybody in Number 10 have been thinking, and how could the culprit, as it were, be anyone but Morgan McSweeney?
Completely, and still seems to be getting the backing of the Prime Minister after having set all these hairs running and then called them all back off again. You just think you've got enough things to be going on with without starting to kind of shadowbox, imaginary enemies. Very, very weird. And totally counterproductive. And as you said, a man who was not over-endowed with popularity, kind of highlighting the fact that even his own party aren't very keen on him. And really a kind of another step along the road of unforced errors in the lead up to the budget, and a kind of preview for things to come as to what was going to happen after the Scottish, Welsh and English local government elections. There's a comment in there. In May of next year.
Yeah, I noticed some of the kind of people that were just, the level of complete astonishment by pretty hardened kind of Commons watchers was really noticeable. But, quite a few of them were saying, well, now that it is this bad, nobody will want to be taking over before the gubbing they're going to get in May. So fundamentally, in a funny kind of way, Although, dear knows, they're actually worse. I shouldn't even be saying anything about the Scotland team in advance of the match tonight. But, if there's something about pulling defeat from the jaws of victory, Labour can beat the Scotland team hands down, right? So, there still could be, the budget still looks like a burach, and we'll come on to that in a minute. But it looks like, even if there is a burach there, it looks like, Keir will have to carry the can through till May, and then they chop him. Because at this rate, it's not just that they're not going to win. The last poll has got them in fourth place, hasn't it, in the UK, for a UK vote, which is behind the Lib Dems now.
And increasingly unpopular, and that unpopularity feeding through to Scottish Labour, and really no way for them to get out under the feet of that at all.
Yeah.
And there's more polling out today, or more analysis by the wonderful Mr. Curtis, or Sir Curtis, that, just basically of those people who were Labour voters last year.
Professor Sir John Curtis.
Indeed.
So we just call him John, right? Just leave all that stuff. Because, the thing is, I always remember this in the broadcasting days, you try to abbreviate something and you just get it wrong. It's like, you can't call people Reverend something. It has to be the Reverend. Just call them John, I'd say.
Well, yes, I do wish they would do that with all of our various lords who keep getting uptitled, rather than just Jimmy that happened to be an MP until they got slung up to the upper house. Just massively, massively unpopular. And 3/4 of people in Scotland, are polled by this YouGov poll, found that they disapproved of the Labour government.
Yeah, there was an interesting breakdown of people who'd voted for each party in 2024, so at the Westminster election, and then saying how many of them would vote for that party again. And that, the SNP, of course, the SNP vote was lower last year, so you could argue there's fewer of them, there's fewer of them to decide who they would vote for, and the SNP will not get anywhere unless they get a real shift back from vote. But by gum, the folk who'd voted Labour, I can't remember the statistic, but it was pretty eye-watering. And the other sort of chat that started was whether or not Starmer could decide to do a John Major. No one will probably remember this, but in 1995, right, Major was being so nipped at that he decided to force the issue by resigning and standing again. It's pointed out that didn't do anything to strengthen Major's authority, and, it wouldn't do much for Keir Starmer either. But the other one is 20% of Labour MPs, there's 405 of them, could trigger a leadership contest. That then gets thrown open to Labour's affiliates and members. But it's pointed out that such a thing has never happened while Labour has been in government. So you've got a kind of completely, we're into the realms of stuff now that for the Labour Party is just existential and has never happened. And that's before we get on to their immigration stuff. But anyway.
Totally. And I say it's kind of more and more of these unforced errors. I mean, if he did do a John Major, that would make him look even less stable than they are at the moment, and just put the tin lid on it. Starmer has made the process more difficult, as you say. They need 20% of the parliamentary Labour Party, so not the members. And of course, the members have just rejected his pick for deputy leader. So, the problems just keep piling up, one on top of the other. I think we'll come on to the immigration stuff in a minute, but again, we've also seen weird U-turns on the speculation around the budget. This kind of push me, pull me budget. There's only 8 sleeps to go until budget day. I'm sure we're all super excited about that.
Sorry, whoop, whoop.
We saw our first Christmas tree yesterday as we were coming home into our estate. We turned in and my daughter said, "Oh, look, there's a Christmas tree." I said, "Don't be ridiculous. No person would be so awful as to have their Christmas tree up at this time." And she's like, no, there definitely was. And I said, "No, you're confused. It must just have been like a pot plant or something in that window." So much so that we actually had to do a U-turn and go back rather weirdly to check. And it was a blooming Christmas tree. But you see, I had banned all Christmas-related matters until after St Andrew's Day.
Which, I mean, you shouldn't be modest about this because you've got a bit of a big gig on then just while we're at it.
Well, absolutely. To which all invited. So yes, Athelstaneford, the birthplace of Scotland's saltire. There'll be a big celebration this year on Sunday, the 30th of November. It's 1:30 in the village of Athelstaneford, which is considered to be the birthplace of Scotland's flag. Lots of interesting people coming, and there's going to be a kind of multi-faith dedication of the new saltire and a flag ceremony there, which will start at 2:00. And then there's a nice kind of happy service in the church, and then tea and buns afterwards.
Right. Yeah. Well organised, my dear. You know, again, you're being quite modest saying that there's quite a lineup. But anyway, if we're not going to that.
Yes, we can't say who the lineup is, but
yes, it's
listeners
impressive.
to this podcast would be more than welcome to come along. And we're celebrating 60 years of the Saltire Memorial being there in Athelstaneford. So all welcome there, and I'll put up some details.
So
about
anyway,
that.
that's your thing, is like you get St Andrew's Day in, and then you can look to, I mean, and that makes total sense. But I mean, I notice even watching stuff on the TV at the moment that the adverts are just absolutely wall to wall. You know, I sort of find myself, without meaning to do it, compiling a sort of list of my least favourite ads, which actually just get me immediately grabbing for the remote. At the moment, it's the Waitrose one with Keira Knightley, which is just what? The second one is the Cadbury one where the guy pops up every year saying you could be a secret Santa or something.
Which I think is quite creepy. I'm surprised this has not actually caused a kind of Daily Mail, stalker sends chocolate bar type story.
Yeah. Anyway, so we're both miserable together in that respect. Yeah. But anyway, so right. Here
Although,
we are,
just very briefly, one of the problems that we have is that we don't watch a lot of linear television.
But it's on it's on the other stuff as well.
Yeah, but lots of stuff we have don't have adverts, and so therefore our children don't actually see.
Not getting the adverts.
They don't see adverts. So you ask them about Christmas, and they have absolutely no needs or wants. And it's a total.
Do you know something? That could actually be. Why are they not advertising it that way? Because now you've put it like that, it could be worth the money to just not have to keep seeing all this stuff.
We actually went onto YouTube the other day and put in searches for, like Christmas haul for, X-year-old girl and forced my daughter to watch it. And she was like, nah, I don't think I need any of that. Like, oh my God.
Your work is done.
Yeah, which was a cheery moment, but you're like, okay, this is not really helping the capitalist society.
Yeah.
So there we are.
How does it work at school? Because I remember from school, if you weren't up with everything that was going on in popular culture, you were just deemed to be a complete weirdo.
Yeah, I suppose they're still at primary school, and they go to a very small kind of Kumbaya type primary school, so they're maybe just kind of slightly sheltered from all of these things. We need to take them to
toughening up lessons
downtown
in the real
governor
world
or something
sometime.
to get them a bit wised up in the once they get older. But yeah, bears are. So yes, worst week of the week for.
Well, we hadn't quite sort of got totally tore into the sort of complete reversal on the budget thing. I mean, presumably the complete collapse in confidence in the sort of Labour government that followed the weird briefing against Wes Streeting stuffy seems to have precipitated a kind of, we just can't force through a kind of a tax cutting budget as planned. That would, tax raising budget that would raise, taxes on the average Joe and Josephine. That was just not going to be possible. So suddenly there's an about turn, and happily there's some extra fiscal headroom from somewhere, and that's being wrapped into a different narrative. I mean, I just don't think, I can't imagine if anybody basically buys that as an explanation. The question would be then whether you care if your particular tax doesn't go up, whatever mumbo jumbo is incanted to sort of not do it. Will that see them through? Or do you get to a stage where there's just been, people have become so detached from any real belief in a direction or, a kind of outlook, because there's been so much chopping and changing. Any attempt to do the sort of, tough but fair, we've got to change the whole shooting match, seems to have been kind of abandoned, except when we come to immigration. This is going to be their little veil.
I mean, that can't be their only sop, and I think
they think it is because it worked in Denmark. But we'll get to that because the Danes have got a pretty effective bloody society, quite apart from
budget. Though you don't have we talked last week or the week before about Rachel Reeves, number 10 briefing room with the big flags and the big lights and the serious face, and this is going to happen, and basically saying, I'm going to break our manifesto commitment and we're going to put up income tax, and you're just going to have to lump it because everything's a horrible mess, and that's just how it is, folks. And it's kind of pitch rolling of the budget has been bigger and more widespread, I think, than any other budget in history. And they got a wee bit of a telling off, as they always do, by the Chancellor, and by the Speaker, rather, yesterday. And the Chief Secretary to the Treasury was hauled into the Commons to answer some urgent questions. But to then kind of come out, a couple of weeks later or a week and a half later and say, actually, folks, don't worry, we're not going to do that anymore, just makes you look completely weak and incompetent.
Yeah.
And, you didn't have to make the big speech. You could have probably gone round and spoken quietly to all your Labour colleagues and said, look, this is going to be in here, but it's top secret for the budget. And, gauged the reception that way, rather than making this is an official government announcement, don't you know? And then, 7 or 8 days later having to come back and say, actually, no, it's not.
I mean, I know nothing about the markets, except that I notice that people who do know about the markets observe that such a complete sort of U-turn in policy is not smiled upon by those who think they want to see a kind of logic to what you choose to do. So that doesn't really help on the kind of, growth front and so on. It's
and it
it's
put
just
up
appalling.
the 10-year gilt yield went up 20 basis points. The 30-year went up to 5.2%. So, she started her speech previously by saying that we had some of the highest borrowing costs globally. That's not been eased. It was slightly back down after all the sort of post Keir Starmer, Wes Streeting stuff kind of evaporated, but it hadn't gone, down. It just kind of slightly settled out a bit. And as you say, that the markets like to, it doesn't really necessarily matter what it is that you're actually pursuing, as long as it's not completely bonkers, but they just like you to kind of stay to it consistently so that they can work out what you're up to and factor the risk accordingly. The risk here is that they're all over the place and nobody knows what they're up to.
Yeah, this reminds me of sort of mechanical arithmetic. I'm old enough to remember all these different types of arithmetic that you had to do. And the mechanical arithmetic I was always quite impressed by, because basically you could get the wrong result, but if you use the right method, you still got about 5 out of 10.
Yeah.
I thought that's the kind of arithmetic for me, actually, So this is kind of like, this is the problem, that there's no mechanical arithmetic in this one. There's no method, which seems to be the thing that's alarming everyone. But anyway, God love her. I mean, I wouldn't want to be Rachel Reeves on a whole load of counts. But then the other thing is, in the midst of all this, strangely enough, the Scottish government came up with this is not their name, kilts.
No,
right?
I'm going to say everything in Scotland has to be cutified by the media, but we're issuing our own Scottish government bonds.
Yeah, which is, actually, Neil Mackay wrote a very amusing piece in the Herald where he kind of basically went off his rocker about calling it kilts. And just kind of said, what other country endures this brainless guff? He said, we were told the Scottish government bonds will be known as kilts, not gilts. It makes you want to bang your head off a pebble dash wall. It's totally. And then he sort of says that he actually spent ages trying to find the source of the term. So he says, as a journalist, I must conclude it was the brainchild of a bored tabloid sub-editor. So he said the term no more useful than miracle tot or brainy boffin. So it is he was kind of looking at the infantile manner of how this was framed. Also sort of just speaks to the inability of anybody, aside from the SNP, to give the Scottish government 1 ounce of credit for this. For having an economy that, okay, you've just explained, the various ways that the whole British economy is kind of deflated at the moment, and it's not the AAA rating that, that the UK enjoyed before Brexit. But, we're still at the same level. There's no catastrophic failure there. And then, of course, the only other bit that was reported was that one of the agencies had said that the ratings could be cut back if Scotland moves towards independence. So everybody kind of jumped on that. Of course, it could go the other way as well, which is the rest of the quote that was coming from at least one of those, ratings agencies. So it's an interesting moment because I don't know how much it entered people's consciousness, but there was just a modest, again, I keep saying this in footballing terms, it was a little bit like a sort of score draw, which was like, well, okay, everything's going a wee bit pear-shaped down the road, but here we are finally putting our head over the parapet and raising some money for stuff. Right, fair enough.
I think that was the most striking thing for me, is that there obviously wasn't enough negative in the story for anybody to actually winkle that out. And the kind of usual players, and we talked obviously about bias in the media last week. So Scotland's been given this AA3 stable rating by Moody's and a AA by Standard & Poor, which basically matches the UK government. It's probable that when we come to sell bonds, there'll be some minor risk premium added on, and it will actually be slightly more expensive than if the Scottish government was simply to get the UK government to borrow on its behalf. And yeah, okay, it might be the rating would change as we were in the lead up to independence, but that's because it's an unknown that the market wants to fret about. It doesn't mean that Scotland is unstable or a basket case. In actual fact, it's extremely investable, as we've spoken about before. And I think this is only a good thing that we'll have this track record in the bond market to fall back on. And there won't be another one of these things where there's not going to be as much of a leap into the unknown when Scotland finally becomes an independent country.
Indeed. I was reading a thing in the FT about this, and their correspondent on this was saying that this does help build credibility with international markets, having a conversation with them. And again, I suppose for people who are very distant from this whole thing, like myself, the bond markets sound like, I don't know, a cross between James Bond and somebody, in one of these kind of high-flying films where they're getting £1 million bonus for something and they're all kind of a bit twatty. But you've got to build relationships with people, whatever it is. And that seems to be what the FT has drilled through to on this. Is sort of saying that you've got to be able to communicate with international investors, show that you've got the credibility to run a sovereign nation on its own. And so the whole process of going for these bonds helps that push. So, better than a kick in the throat.
Yeah. Talking about things that were chopping and changing, the UK government said that it's going to have a review of the decision not to pay compensation to the WASPI Women, which I think the WASPI Women are pretty sharp to note is just a delaying tactic.
Yeah, this was, in the midst, I can't remember at what point in the guddle this one popped up, but it could have been at the big, before the big guddle began. But Pat McFadden, who's the Work and Pension Secretary, suddenly announced that the government was withdrawing from a judicial review about the WASPI pensions row and said it was reconsidering the decision not to stamp up cash. Now, again, when you have this, it's like the same excuse. You know how if you were using excuses to get out of anything, you had to be very careful that your auntie only broke her leg once. Do you know what I mean?
You've got to have a good memory to lie, as my father always said. I'm pretty crap at that. It's like, no, cut out.
Having teeth out once, stuff like that. So anyway, here we have Rachel Reeves suddenly having information that she didn't have before, which, to be fair, there is economic information coming in all the time, but still, that's the kind of, look, we can actually completely change our entire policy for the budget. When it comes to Pat McFadden, a particular document had not been shown to his predecessor, Liz Kendall. Slap my thigh. So she made her verdict, which was doofing the WASPI Women, without having this critical document, the details of which are not really revealed. So he's saying, retaking this decision, and there's the next thing. So everyone's WASPI people and anybody connected to them, who is a lot of people, because these are women, mothers, grannies, that they're and they've campaigned very well. So, there's a lot of people going, oh, hang on a minute, this could be game back on again. And then as you begin to get a kind of, maybe Labour's not all that completely, cloth-eared, McFadden comes out with, retaking this decision should not be taken as an indication the government will necessarily award financial redress. See, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away, but the Lord possibly giveth again. But when you do that just too many times and use your excuse up, a bit. You just leave people, they're like limp rags by the time you finally concede what is effectively a maximum of 2,000 quid per woman. So it's not going to be a holiday in Bermuda for anybody. And it's been taken, it's so grudgingly done. What was if you can't take that decision ahead of the budget, what was the point in saying it at all?
Totally. It's really a sop, I think, because they're currently defending a judicial review, which might require them to go and look at the decision again. So they're going to go and look at the decision again and then be able to go back to the judicial review to say this has been taken, having due consideration to all of the facts. It is the Ombudsman recommendation was between £1,000 and £2,950 per woman for those affected. The WASPI Women, I think, were looking for somewhere closer to 10,000 that they've estimated as the actual loss. And let's not forget that the Ombudsman took the unusual step of laying this report directly to Parliament, so not sending it to the government first, because they didn't think that the DWP was a kind of fair actor and wouldn't actually provide the remedy that it instructed it to do.
Yeah. Well, anyway, we wait to hear what will happen.
Aye.
So is it just 8 days till it's 8?
Yeah, eight
sleeps
until the budget. Yep.
Right, 8 days. Gosh, okay, right. So hang on, what will we do next week then?
The budget is on the wedding. Yeah, well, we'll have to think about that.
Yeah, we'll have to think about that. I mean, it might be, well, people can let us know what they think, but because who knows what else they'll have managed to do by then, or the world will do, or whatever. It's not as if we're struggling for stuff to talk about these days. Yeah. But on the other hand, so much does pivot on that one. It probably would be a bit weird not to cover it. Anyway, thoughts to the
we shall ponder
people.
That further, and you can certainly get in touch with us at podcast@LeslieRoof.
No, it's not that. It's hello at.
There's actually 2 email addresses.
Is there? Well, I never see the one that's podcast. Does that come to you?
No, it comes to me.
Oh, God, right. So it goes into the black hole of the Thompson House. Right, from which nothing ever escapes. Okay, well, you could take your pick. If you want to send me something, I'm a hello at. And then if you want to send Fraser something, he's at podcast at. There we are.
So there we go. That'll be the competition now and see who gets. So yes, 36 sleeps till Christmas, 12 until St. Andrew's Day, and 8 until the budget.
Right.
I believe, just to...
So,
all you date seekers there. Immigration, God almighty.
Yeah.
I mean, this is their big thing that they think is going to bring them round, and there's a lot of heavy lifting being done by the Danish, and they're a socialist party just like what we are, and we need to get tough and end the golden ticket of becoming a UK citizen.
This one is a tough one for me because there's no question that, Denmark, there's many things that are kind of, are difficult about the Denmark thing for anyone who is, if you like, politically liberal and on the left about this question of immigration, because the general argument all of us have, and I've heard it this morning on the Today programme with Clive Lewis in the Labour Party, who is just horrified basically at what's happened to Labour with this. But, he was saying, we've all said that, if there's better provision, if the poverty gap is smaller, if people in hopeless communities don't feel quite as hopeless, you would get less othering and scapegoating and pointing fingers at migrants. Now, you look at Denmark, I've got to say, its standards are just better. There is a smaller inequality gap. There is better public services for people. And at one point, which is what triggered all this, in 2015, the Danish People's Party was polling at about 24% of the vote, which is, kind of fairly similar to what's been going on here. And I realised now when I was making the film, and we were I can't even remember which years are which now, but I think it was probably 2023 or something. We'll come to this in a second. This ghetto law, which basically wheaks out non-Westerners by saying there has to be a cap on the amount of social housing. Social housing usually used by people who haven't got other places to stay. So there's a disproportionate use of that by people who come in through asylum or other immigration routes. So talking about having a cap on the amount of social housing in any one sort of ward of a city is a easy sort of non-ethnic way of starting to talk about immigration. But anyway, it's now fairly overtly talked about by having the ghettos that people talked about. The ghetto law is now talked about as parallel communities. So the Denmark saying it wants more integration and parallel communities where there's a concentration of people who come from, from outside Denmark is not a good thing. We could get back onto this because, again, as I've said before, Scotland is right up there in terms of successful integration, and Sweden is kind of perhaps one of the worst. But the way you don't integrate people is by sticking them in any kind of concentration. It doesn't matter what kind of housing, barracks, whatever it is. As soon as you're an identifiable other that is not integrated through the whole society, you become really easy targets. So anyway, 2015, the Mette Frederiksen, who'd taken over as a Social Democrat leader, decided they needed to do something pretty dramatic. And so they did do that thing where they brought in Rwanda, which was perhaps where the Tories got Rwanda from, because they were discussing Rwanda. Now, they too have run aground with Rwanda, but still, that's what they were thinking about, outside processing. But they have absolutely made it very, very tough for asylum seekers to come to Denmark. It has had the result that they have far fewer people coming to Denmark, but also there's been a complete collapse in the vote for the Danish People's Party. There's a very interesting podcast that was done by a BBC guy who went over. I should just say, a very good veteran Scottish correspondent that I would take seriously, who was talking to everybody concerned with it. And what the Labour people were saying there, Social Democrats, was that once they managed to get this question of immigration kind of off the top agenda, they were able to kind of get back onto a lot of the other stuff they wanted to do. So they've managed to get quite far in the green transition, on housing, on better heating, all that kind of stuff. At the moment, we're just stuck talking about immigration. But the really interesting thing that they said at the end of this was that the architect of this policy was asked what he thought about it for Britain. And he said, it'll never work in Britain. He thought, this is the kind of interview you do where you think, oh, right, actually, you could put this at the start of the programme. This would be the end. But he said, you guys have just got you've got too multicultural a society over too many centuries even. Denmark has this is true of all the Nordic countries. They are tremendously white. They've been very homogeneous. It's part of the strength that they've had, that they can count on a sort of similarity of outlook. But it creates quite a shock to the system when you get the relatively big increases that everybody's seen since the Syrian war hit its peak in 2015, 2016. There's no practice, basically, at dealing with difference. The Brits, for better or worse, have, obligations because we had an empire that stretched across the world and exploited people all over the place, and then ended up having obligations towards them in the Commonwealth, and have had a long period of having to come to terms with that, however you feel about that. So the Dane who was talking, who'd actually lived in Britain, so he said, I do feel I know what I'm talking about. The othering and everything that will happen as a result of this kind of change of language and change of policy is so dangerous in a society that is already as multicultural as yours. And the final point to put, which is pretty salient for Labour, is that it's Denmark, like every other sane country in the world, has got a proportional parliament. And that means that if you are the Social Democrats and you take a bit of a tilt to the right to make sure that you basically club the Danish People's Party to oblivion, and people don't like that, they can vote Green or they can vote one of the other parties that has got a different position on it. And when it comes to elections, you will still get transfers from them. So you haven't lost their vote completely. It's proportional. So, you can have a position that people might not like, but over the piece, you will still end up with a left government because you'll get these other guys elected by folk that don't like you, and you can still work with them. So you've basically got actually not very much political change. in first past the post, if Labour now lose all the lefties to the Greens, even the Lib Dems, and if your party ever get their act together and others, and in Scotland, obviously, the SNP and Plaid, they've gone. And the other possibility is you split the vote and reform comes right through the middle.
Wanging back in.
Yeah.
And look, guys, this is how to do it properly, because this is, a lot of these things
really
are just
worth
gimmicks.
when people hear this, this is what comes from kind of comparing not like with like, right? Is that single small difference is a freaking massive difference in terms of what you might well have opened up here.
Yeah. I think some of these things are kind of big, serious changes. Other of them are more kind of gimmicky. But, there's some pretty serious things in here which are unlikely to go down very well with Labour's own base and its own MPs. And it's a kind of continuing rightward drift for the Labour Party, which I don't think will go down particularly well with the electorate in Scotland. And I do wonder how it's going to impact if we're already seeing refugee asylum seekers who are granted status in England coming to large Scottish cities like Glasgow and Edinburgh to report as homeless because they're not being provided with support in England. There's the end to this guaranteed housing and financial support of destitute asylum seekers as part of this package of moves. And also just the kind of instability of it, that instead of having a permanent refugee status or a refugee status for 5 years, it's now going to be 2 years, and it'll be, or 2.5 years, it'll be subject to review. So if there's a kind of small pickup in the stability of your home country, you might very well be at risk of deportation. And regardless of whether you've got a family with young children or what, you wouldn't have any kind of sense of permanency.
Yeah, and a friend of mine who has been very active in the health service was pointing out that many refugees have medical backgrounds and end up working in the NHS. And she was pointing out too that the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR, says that fiscally, refugees are net contributors to our economy. So, that's a pretty big one, because what that then suggests is that, strangely enough, in the same way as the outlook of changing your budget strategy doesn't get smiled on by the old markets and all, there's the possibility that changing this doesn't actually particularly please the money people, because they do regard refugees as net contributors. There's very long, interesting pieces at the moment about the problems that Europe has with a dwindling birth rate. Because ironically, that is what then also, however, makes people look around and say there's just a changing demographic here. Because I was looking at figures for the Nordic countries, there's been roughly an 18%. 18% now are immigrants to the Nordic countries, and the birth rate, the native birth rate, if you want, is pretty much not. It's not reproducing itself as a population. So at the same moment, you actually need to think that you need a workforce, as you actually begin to notice that the composition of that workforce is changing completely. And yes, there's racism in it, because the largest chunk of that for the Nordics and Denmark has been Ukrainians, which nobody's batted an eyelid at. It changes when it's Syrians and folk from the southern part of the world. But again, listening to that very interesting podcast, something that I picked up when I was in Nordic countries, and I've spoken about before, is this sort of what they call intolerance of the intolerant. There was one guy who was talking about being a teacher in an area of Denmark, of Copenhagen, that is now one of these parallel communities. And he was a teacher, and he got some graphic up about gay marriage or whatever. And one of the other teachers said to him, "You'll need to take that down, because we will get huge numbers of complaints from Muslim parents." And I don't know, I don't live in the real world enough to know how much people are grappling with the different outlooks that come with different backgrounds. I do notice dangerously swerving into the Your Party meltdown that one of the MPs who's left the posse, it seemed to be over an argument about trans people and where they should be placed physically within meetings in a separate grouping, which is kind of pretty weird. So you do get different backgrounds, different cultures take a bit of getting your head round. And that is certainly sitting at the base of where a lot of people feel uncomfortable. And yet, if you're a politician, you have to be looking to a slightly longer game on this, which is just back to the question of workforce. We relied hugely. I mean, we're going back to the things about the prison guards. The prisons can't attract people here because of the problems there are managing over stacked prisons, and people trying to argue for special exemptions from the crackdown on immigration for people in these industries. So it's kind of a bit all over the place. A final thing to note: she's got a great wee graph here, which is from the UN, is refugees by country of asylum. I mean, Lebanon is right up there. I mean, obviously these guys. This is figures in 2024. So clearly, everybody that's close to Gaza at the moment is experiencing the most. But so Lebanon is probably an unusual position. Germany, is on 31 asylum seekers per 1,000, so 31. France is 10. The UK is 6.
Yeah.
So we're just not at the top of the poll with any of this stuff, and there's so many big questions as to whether or not what's perceived to be a clampdown will actually stop the boats crossing. I mean, again, I heard people discussing this morning about why is it that some asylum seekers are just so intent. One guy was reporting a guy from Sudan who had spent weeks trying to cross in all sorts of conditions to the UK. And I mean, having done a lot of stuff in Africa back in the day, it's a weird thing to say this, but part of this is the world's surface. There's a weird thing where within a lot of countries, the BBC's reach and offer of a kind of relatively unpartisan news service has left people. I mean, I can remember kind of how often I found this, that people were just speechless with admiration for Britain. Because the experience of their own country, I mean, I can remember when I was doing Africa Women, training the gals in 1999, 2000, and discovering that NGOs in Africa paid journalists to write what they wanted.
Mm.
Everybody paid people to get the outcomes they wanted. And the idea that you would actually be doing stuff that was kind of free from all that influence, it was almost mind-blowing to a lot of the gals who were involved. So if you live in a society like that, another woman had to bribe people. She bought a new bath. I can remember this because we ended up getting bath. I can't remember, think of the right word for it. Taps, and she ended up, however, having a bath that she couldn't bribe the officials to connect the water to. So the level of corruption that was, and that's a wee while ago, not sure how much it's changed. If that's your normal, where you just know everyone's at it, and you do then get the world service, which there's radios everywhere in Africa, not tellies, but radios. So people are really drinking this in, and they hear a set of standards, which obviously we don't even blooming adhere to ourselves now, but a kind of outlook which sounds to them like a country you'd want to live in. And because of our colonial past, there are more countries in Africa that are English speaking than German, Norwegian, whatever else. So, people are listening in a language they can understand, hearing something that sounds like the kind of liberal democracy they'd like to live in. The shit hits the fan with places like Sudan and all the different, destructive forces that are going on in Africa at the moment. And you immediately think, where's the one place that feels like home? And it is Britain. So I'm just not surprised the guy from Sudan particularly was kind of on an absolute mission to get here. And it's a total irony, really, because the Britain that's being portrayed is just not the
but
Britain
60 years out of date.
Yes, it is. Terribly ironic and sad. But I mean, this is where we are.
I mean, we will see how this develops into legislation and what of it actually survives and how much they're able to craft the narrative. That's obviously designed very much as a kind of news story, and I think they were pleased with the coverage. This was welcomed by Farage and what have you. Whether this does anything to move the dial is unclear. The majority of people, when polled, I think it's still the case, are not against immigration or refugees and asylum seekers, but more this kind of feeling of a lack of control. And that comes out, of course, in the right-wing media all the time with kind of spurious cases of people having multiple attempts to prevent their deportation. We've seen obviously all the recent stuff with foreign national offenders not being deported correctly or just let out of the jails by accident. It may well be that this has some positive impact in terms of the kind of dampening down of those types of stories. And if people feel that the immigration and asylum policy is more controlled, a lot of these problems are down to the inefficiencies and competence that there have been over the last 20, 30 years at the Home Office and actually making the decisions in these applications. You know, we've got people just languishing around for years and years and years without any decision being made, becoming integrated or having to find ways of working, even if they don't have a status which permits them to work, and kind of finding their way into black markets and other forms of exploitation, which sort of deepens their connection to the UK, rather than their decision being made on their application being taken in a kind of timely manner and either being accepted and being brought in and put on a path to citizenship so that they can contribute and be a successful member of a community. You're kind of kept in limbo for huge periods of time, pushing you onto the fringes of society, making it more likely that you'll experience poverty and potentially be exposed to criminality in a way that's very counterproductive for the moral good of society as a whole.
Well, and then there's that thing, because this is the hard thing to talk about, just is the moral end of this. And I'm kind of, walking about slightly thinking, actually, I was thinking about Mo Farah. And, I was thinking about the alternative stories of refugees who've come to this country and have been, absolutely at the centre of love of people and respect by people towards. I could have prepared a list, actually, of the names of people that we respect and have and understand have had to overcome unbelievable stuff. And then we'll all go to watch films, actually, that will tell the stories of the unbelievable stuff. And we'll sit and watch Channel 4 News or whatever, and telling that, the horror of what people are escaping from, to the extent that, when I'm limping around here with the Achilles problem or anything else, I just can't imagine what it's like being in Ukraine at the moment, or, still worse, Gaza, that now doesn't even have a media spotlight on it because it's supposed to have a peace process happening, or the West Bank, or any of these things where you've got nothing now left except a little paper bag that you carry around with your children. And I don't think I've got any problems here. And it's, you would look at those people and you would start to want to judge them and decide potentially. I know that Shabana Mahmood, I wish people would just get their sounds into people's names here, but, she said when she was challenged on this that there's no plans to take people's jewellery off them. I mean, are we there that you even have to answer this? That, yeah, they might have to cough up if they can afford a car or some other goods like that, but we won't get down to the jewellery on it. And I mean, obviously, the resonance of that.
We don't want to be too much like the actual Nazis.
Yes. And the thing is, I mean, again, a pal posted a thing making this point. This is how the Nazis started. They homed in on the Jews as people. If the Jews had anything or anyone had stolen anything, or there's some criminal thing associated with them, it got hyper ventilated until there was a complete frothing atmosphere. And at a meeting I was at yesterday, there was a pal here at it who comes from Ayr. And he was out canvassing there, and he said he was absolutely gobsmacked at the people that used to be, sort of reasonably left people that had been canvassed previously, who were basically saying, yeah, immigration was the number one thing because thousands of illegal immigrants were landing in air. And, it is almost laughable, but you can't laugh at people when you're trying to get their vote, So happily, he'd done a bit of, his work. And I think it's North Ayrshire, there are 14 refugees. Or it could even be 14 asylum seekers, the total.
Yeah. But it's the disconnect between what you think and what you hear and what you're being told. Versus the reality is just so stark, and this is the kind of only game in town at the moment for kind of media coverage.
Because the trouble is, as I was saying, I don't get out enough, right? I sort of definitely don't. None of us do. We're all living in ghettos, essentially, of our own social construction. So if somebody says to me, the education system is falling to pieces, I have no direct knowledge of how to, I'd need to talk to pals who are working in it or something like that and seek them out. Then that's just their particular anecdote from their area. It's very hard to have a general overview feeling of where things are at. So this is where the overall tone of things matters so much, because you can't write this argument in your head by just flipping it round to cope with your own experience. I mean, I met a woman who'd come up the road from England and was ranting on about all the asylum seekers that she was having to deal with in the GP surgery she worked in. Now, that's sort of a hard one to argue with in a way, because it's her lived experience that, she can see the number of people joining the books. And she was talking as well about having gone to accident and emergency and how that didn't work. And I said, just as a matter of interest, was accident and emergency also overwhelmed by refugees? And she was honest enough to say, well, no, actually. And I said, well, there you are. The problem with A&E is not to do with being overwhelmed by, unfit, damaged and injured asylum seekers. It's to do with a crap system, underfunding, and a privatised, system south of the border. You're not going to get anything. Everything becomes fairly conflated, and this now with Labour just allowing this conflation to happen, and that bit where Shabana Mahmood is standing, sort of saying, people worry about a broken system because it is broken. Well, that's it official now. So what's broken about it? Broken is just there's too many desperate people wanting our help. How very freaking dare they?
Yeah.
And yet, what they're cruising towards, a lot of people are saying, yeah, actually, this white paper will end up in the courts, whether at national level or at Strasbourg level, because if we are, and this is, of course, the next one, if we stay within the European Convention of Human Rights, you have to comply with Strasbourg's interpretation of protection of children's rights, of association, of family association and all. So that could basically look like it's coming a cropper. But as these commentators are observing, that could actually be a double win for Labour. Because, if you're talking about the populist right, they also hate the European courts. And, of course, the enemies of the people in the domestic courts. So if that's another part of the reform agenda, which is to sort of demonise what they can dismiss as a sort of liberal elite, the sort of what was it Keir Starmer's phrase, or who was it about the lawyers that, the lawyers they keep coming to the rescue with endless, sort of appeals for people and whatever, stopping it. It was actually, there was the Tories, apologies, Keir Starmer. But, the last time that was the problem, was this liberal kind of elite. Well, that's another win for Labour if that they think that that's something that will also cozy them up to those voters. But where does this leave you? When you've basically now, you've put a hole through every wall. It's going to get bloomin' nippy in there because all the stuff that people thought was part of the house has now had a dirty great hole knocked in it.
Yeah, it's all been undermined. Well, this will be developing, I think, for sure, and for quite a long way to go. Another worst week of the week award would perhaps go to your party, although some positives in lots of comment this week that seem certain that the Scottish part of it will likely be independent supporting and is possibly going to be a federal structure rather than a kind of branch office, although I think the Corbyn core would prefer to have a branch office, but it all seems open and much to play for. Jeremy Corbyn had an interview with the National, but at the same token, they've still got this unbelievable guddle over their money, and a statement being put out by the sort of Corbyn core and the other independent MPs that joined, basically saying that Zara Sultana hasn't handed over the cash. They've had a small proportion of cash handed over, but not the rest. So, I mean, if this had happened to a putative new Scottish party, it would have been getting crucified every day in the week until it disappeared. Your party still seems to have a pretty elastic support base and is still moving on.
It is weird, actually, because, I mean, they're kind of breaking all the laws of political gravity here, where, having open disagreements to the extent that half the party is accusing Shabana Mahmood, I'm getting all my Shabanas mixed up, to Zara Sultana of having waltzed off with the cash. And she's basically saying, I'm giving tranches of it over, and there's legal reasons I can't give the whole 600,000 in a oneer. You read further through the whole thing and I actually lose the will to live. I mean, I've tried to understand who's on what side and what's the nature of the disagreements they have with one another. But apart from the fact that there is, just as we were saying the previous week, where there was a bit of, it seemed you reported, a bit of friction about some of the folk who'd come in from a sort of Alba direction towards your party. And, people beginning to kind of rankle and say, well, look, that's not the kind of lefties that we want to be. You can't just open a great port up and not expect to have a really pretty robust environment in there, especially if you haven't already sorted out some big policy items that should really just clear down some of the folk who cannot be part of it. At the moment, they're trying to, it's a come all ye, and that's cool, but you're sort of rapidly hitting these problems of personality, of cultural background, of political perspective. And yet, despite all of this, they're polling above Alba in the polls in Scotland. And they're also polling reasonably. I can't remember what the figure is at the UK level, but I mean, it's
well, it was very high that we talked about a few weeks ago. It's quite stratospherically high for something that doesn't actually exist. And
it's only been in the headlines to report people basically taking lumps out of one another.
Yeah.
So people desperately want something. They want something to exist in that corner. And they probably, different parts of the left movement, variously respect Zara Sultana for taking a stand and, kind of basically leaving Labour over the question of Gaza, which is still a very, very, very big issue within the left. And then, everybody who supported Jeremy Corbyn back in the day and could see perfectly well that he was basically levered out. So if you put those two together, but it's a bit like that where you think, if friend A is a friend of yours and friend B is, why don't A and B get on, So just that you've got mum and dad there and people like
pals,
them,
yes.
it just doesn't make them like each other. And they so plainly don't like each other.
And I'm still staggered just in my kind of I'm the person who normally organises all of the infrastructure for projects and is the kind of project manager guy, that the sort of Zara Sultana wing went off and set up a email list and a payment processing account and a bank account and a company to take this money without it being agreed by everybody else, and they're now, they've sent 200,000. They're maybe going to send the rest once their other liabilities have been met. And then one lot wanted to hand over the legal responsibility to the other lot, but the other lot wouldn't take it because it wasn't quite clean enough, and so it goes on.
Yeah, I mean, anybody who thinks it's easy to set up a political party these days, my God, all the cautionary examples are sitting around there, which is why, I guess it is worth having big conversations about the directions of the parties that exist, because, much as people will come up at a lot of events I do and say, we support this kind of emphasis on small is beautiful. Let's get local. Let's decentralise Scotland. Let's get a new face of this country that's just not British in that single respect, as well as many others. Let's do land reform. Let's get that kind of set of policies that all the other political parties just think are too hot to trot, too structural, too big. Just get a party to do all that. And you seriously look around you at this. If you're going to be democratic, you have to have branches everywhere. You have to have a structure. You have to get the money in from somewhere. And as soon as you teeter off in a direction that questions every existing interest, you're going to get nothing except, what you would get from punters. And then you need extraordinary amounts of energy, creativity, because you will be having to make people wrong who are really politically quite close to you, which is, the SNP, the Greens, sometimes the Lib Dems on a good day. This is a very, very difficult thing to put your life into, as pretty much everybody is finding that's set up in individual parties.
Very much so. Moving on then, you mentioned Alba earlier. The Alba Party has launched its latest campaign to oppose any new onshore wind farms. It was a speech by Kenny McCaskill in Inverness, that whilst we're blessed with enormous energy wealth, once again, we're being treated as a resource to be exploited. I suppose this fitted into some degree to the Highland Wind Farm Revolt film that you produced recently. And Alba Party are basically saying that there should only be offshore wind granted, and that this current process is just not working for Scots because it's not bringing down commercial energy costs, and it's not bringing down domestic energy costs.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for that. The costs of doing offshore, are obviously higher than onshore, but I think the planning procedure is a lot more straightforward because you haven't got communities sitting really opposing things very vigorously. You've still got the problems of connection and a grid that isn't sitting ready to take any of this. And then the political fact that where they are taking it is not for your population in Scotland, but the south of England, wherever it is, offshore, onshore. So from the UK government's point of view, that there's still going to be angry people. And same for the Scottish government. And the trouble is that I think the anger is still towards the Scottish government that hasn't basically come riding to the rescue. So it's probably not a bad position for Kenny McCaskill and Alba to pick up. It just doesn't seem to be anything that they're coming up with policy-wise is sort of cutting through, though. So he's got a lot to say that makes sense. I've read some of the stuff that he has written as well about the prison service, because he was Justice Secretary back in the day. And that makes a lot of sense too. It must be just really heartbreaking to have got quite a lot of policy content that is pretty on the money, and to know it's going nowhere for reasons that are just sort of, it's too late to try and turn the clock back on the many reasons that Alba have not managed to kind of cut through. I don't know if people feel that there's more time to put into this project, but I just wonder how much energy activists could feel when they keep seeing the polling bumping along so low for the next Holyrood elections even.
Yeah, and then, obviously you get the Lib Dems coming in with what I like to think of as unearned income, doing extremely well in the polls for no real reason other than that they're not the Scottish Labour Party or the Conservatives.
This is the way that you
and
have
the kind
to.
of homeless people need to stick their vote somewhere. And they think, oh, well, they're nice, aren't they? And you think, well, no, they're not. Just look at them. They're one of the nastiest parties around, but they've got this kind of bizarre kind of impenetrable halo effect that people don't look at them properly. And then your party is an absolute guddle. Whereas, you're maybe sitting in Alba thinking, actually, we're kind of sorting ourselves out now. They're able to stand candidates at Holyrood. They've got the branches, they've got the infrastructure, and they're coming up with the policies. I mean, there's a lot to play for. There's still 5.5 months to go until the election. Where they're going to get a fair crack of the media whip, perhaps is doubtful. If it's kind of shaping up that the story of the 2026 election is going to be your party as a kind of new kid on the block, interesting, media tidbit, versus the crumbling Scottish Labour support. And the SNP kind of trundling along in a kind of slightly boring governmental fashion.
Yeah, I was just going to say that you get that. Oh God, I completely forgotten what I was going to say. That's the trouble when you sort of you just kind of lose the plot. Right, so move on. There was a wee analogy in there. I know what it was. It was that thing with the Liberals of the Lib Dems. When you're doing multiple choice answers, you apparently have to weight them against C.
It's just close enough.
Yeah, I can remember this from again, back in the, the days of the 11 plus and everything, when everybody was trying to get top tips. So you're trying to kind of game the system if you hadn't basically a clue. Mm. So the advice was just don't keep going for C, because they know that's the kind of haven't a clue. It's not the A, it's not the, the extreme answers.
It must be somewhere in the middle.
It's going to be C. So, I mean, the Lib Dems definitely benefit from some of that. And, just in a way, just Ed Davey then taking up the human being stuff. And human beings do some weird things. The Lib Dems, the willingness to fling yourself into water, downsides, sort of humiliate yourself essentially as a grown adult. The fact people do know he's a carer, it sort of works a bit for him. He looks like a hush puppy. I can't really explain why. So some of that is kind of helping. And there's a comment actually made in a paper here. Somebody was talking about, the future, suggesting a future slogan for the Green Party. And they were suggesting that it should be "Make Hope Normal." And so what they were trying to sort of focus on was the loss of hope there is now in society. And that is what, the Lib Dems will pick up on some of that, because they are just, they seem to be just a sort of not so extreme on the market front. Yeah, they used to support Europe until it looked a bit unpopular. Then brave Sir Robin ran away very, very quickly. And it still annoys me when, any commentators will say the Lib Dems, the only party that basically opposed Brexit. Excuse me.
Yes.
But still, that narrative will help. So, yeah.
Jolly good. Well, on that note, we will probably see you next Tuesday, folks. We might be Wednesday, so watch this space. The Salvo Liberation Scotland extra went out on general release last Wednesday, so if you've not noted that yet, just look back one episode and you'll be able to check that out. We'll put the links that we've talked about in the show notes. You're very welcome to come along and watch the flag ceremony and the jollification on St Andrew's Day at Athelstaneford, the birthplace of Scotland's saltire. And on that flag raising note, we will see you next week, chums.